Coming up on this episode, I'll tell you everything you need to know as the Warriors prepare to resume their season against the Sacramento Kings at Golden One Center on Friday. I'll look at that matchup, the recent NBA news that affects Golden State, the state of the roster, the rotation that we should see moving forward, the schedule ahead for Golden State and their key rivals in the Western Conference, and how far can the Warriors really go, particularly after their blockbuster acquisition of Jimmy Butler. Welcome back to the Golden State with Mates podcast. It's just under 17 hours until the Warriors resume their season against the Kings at Golden One Center on Friday. By the time you guys are watching or listening to this, it's probably more like less than 12 hours left. There's an air of expectation. There's an excitement around the Warriors right now, which just hasn't been there for a lot of the season, at least since the 12-3 start. And it kind of makes me a little nervous because there actually is some anticipation and some expectation about what this team could do moving forward. But before I get into that, before I get into the matchup against the Kings, just a couple of bits of NBA news that I think are really important to Golden State and their aspirations, obviously, for the rest of the season. So just to recap what we've seen in the league over the last 24 hours, probably the biggest news, undoubtedly, I think, is the season-ending health issue. I was going to call it an injury, but it's more so a health issue for Victor Wembanyama. And this is incredibly disappointing for the San Antonio Spurs and for NBA fans in general. Like, I watched the Spurs-Suns game earlier or yesterday for you guys that are now watching or listening to this. And I was really devastated not to watch Wemby play. I love watching that guy play. He always puts his heart out on the floor, and we know how talented he is. We know how unique of a player he is. So for him to be out for the season, I think is really disappointing. For us as fans to be cruel of that opportunity to watch him play is disappointing. Now, from a Warrior perspective, to take a silver lining out of it, and I don't like to look at injuries from a positive point of view necessarily, because, again, it's really disappointing. There's no doubt about that. I can't understate that enough, or overstate that enough, I should say. But from a Warrior perspective, the Spurs obviously now, without their best player, without Wemby, are probably not going to be in the play-in tournament mix. And therefore, this does make the Warriors' life a little bit easier in terms of at least securing a top 10 seed in the Western Conference. The Spurs obviously have just acquired De'Aaron Fox, so they can still be dangerous. But I think with this Wemby news, particularly as the season progresses into the final few weeks, final month kind of thing, you could see them pull back a bit. And unfortunately, that's just probably the reality of their scenario now with Wemby out for the season with this deep vein thrombosis, which is a very serious health issue that hopefully he can get on top of and return fully healthy for next season. But it does help the Warriors out, particularly obviously in the race to first and foremost get to the play-in tournament. Hopefully they go so far that they don't even need the play-in tournament, that they can secure a playoff berth without that. And really they shouldn't be looking behind them in the Western Conference standings right now. But again, having acquired De'Aaron Fox and having him and Wemby at the forefront of that team, the Spurs were a dangerous team to potentially push up into the play-in tournament mix and potentially overtake the Warriors and some other teams. So from that point of view, it's not a bad result for Golden State, it must be said. Again, I must say it's disappointing not to be able to watch Wemby play here over the rest of the season, but hopefully the Warriors can take advantage of this with a couple of victories later in the season against the Spurs, which I think come in the last couple of weeks, which is probably the right time to want to play the Spurs because, again, maybe by those final couple of weeks, they've realised that the play-in tournament and therefore the playoffs are out of reach and that they may rest up a De'Aaron Fox. They may rest Chris Paul. They may rest Devin Vassell. Who knows what they're going to be doing with a couple of weeks left in the season. But we saw today they beat the Suns, so they're still capable. They're still competitive. But again, that might reduce a little bit. They might pull back from trying to be going all out in winning games here as the close of the season progresses here and we do reach the final weeks. The other big piece of news, I suppose, was the Bobby Portis suspension, 25-game ban for violating the league's drug policy. Not really going to get into that. It's in terms of the relevance to the Warriors. Look, there's not really, obviously, different conference, so there's not too much relevance. The only thing that I would say is that it kind of has put Giannis' future back on the horizon, and Shams came out earlier today or yesterday again for you guys as you watch or listen to this, and did kind of talk about Giannis' future and the direction of the Milwaukee Bucks. And if they have another playoff failure this season, then again, his future could be really, really under the microscope. So from a Golden State perspective, I know they've just acquired Jimmy Butler, but I can absolutely guarantee you that Joe Lacob and the franchise certainly still has aspirations of landing Giannis Antetokounmpo if he was ever to become available via trade. I can guarantee you that. They now have Butler's, extension money that they've just given him as a potential salary matching means for a big piece like Giannis. Maybe they look at KD, which by the sounds of the reporting and by the sounds of what KD has said himself, it sounds like his decision to reject a Golden State trade prior to the deadline really came down to him just simply not wanting to leave the Suns mid-season. Now, that may change when he gets to be able to sit down in the offseason and have a little bit more of a think about it. It doesn't sound like he was totally against the Warriors, so maybe I think his comments left the door ajar a little bit in terms of a potential reunion with Golden State down the track. I don't think it was an emphatic no, full stop, we're never going to talk about this again. So I think that's interesting, but the Giannis piece of it, the Bucks are 5th in the East right now. If they drop to 6th, drop just one spot or maybe 2 or 3 here over the remainder of the season with Bobby Portis out. And I'm not saying Bobby Portis is any kind of star, but he is a very valuable key piece to their rotation. Has averaged nearly 14 points, nearly just over 8 rebounds a game this season. He's been 3rd in 6 man of the year voting each of the last 2 years. So this is a good, valuable rotation piece for the Bucks. It's now going to be missing for the majority now of the regular season. And if they drop one spot or drop a couple more spots, then really they're either going to see one of the top 3 seeds in the East in the first round of the playoffs, which is the Cavs and the Celtics, or the Knicks. And therefore, in a first-round series, the Bucks will probably go in as underdogs. And if you're the Warriors or you're any team in the league that has aspirations of trading for Giannis Antetokounmpo at all, then you're going to want the Milwaukee Bucks to crash and burn, and you're going to want them to completely collapse again in the first round of the playoffs. And not even collapse, but just come up against a good team like the Celtics or the Cavs or the Knicks, who are arguably just better than them, right? And then again, Giannis might look around and say, okay, what are we really doing here? Can we rebuild a contender? Because we know the pairing of Steph Curry and Giannis Antetokounmpo, they are good friends. It was interesting, I think, who was it? Was it Sam, Om Young Masuk, I think, of ESPN might have said it, or Sam Amick of The Athletic. I'm getting my journos mixed up. I think it was Young Masuk of ESPN he said on the Hoop Collective podcast about a month ago now that the Warriors are in a unique position, or uniquely positioned, to try and obtain someone like Giannis if he was to become available. And I don't think that's going to be off the table even with the Jimmy Butler acquisition. I don't think that's going to be the case. So just monitor the Bucks here moving forward. And if they drop down the standings and therefore have to play one of the Cavs, Celtics, or the Knicks in the first round, which would obviously be a tough task. But we're getting back into some trade stuff there after the deadline. So let's move on to some more basketball perspective. So as I said before, the Spurs beat the Suns today, which I think is a good result for the Warriors in terms of the standings, because I think the Suns are now a bigger threat than the Spurs in terms of teams behind them in the standings. The Suns are now a full 2 games behind. The Spurs are 3 games behind. So there's a little bit of a buffer there. Again, not a whole lot necessarily, but a little bit of a buffer. And the Suns look terrible right now. Really, really terrible. I'm like, KD and Booker, they're putting up their numbers, but defensively, they suck. They just do. And so you look at this team and you wonder, you look at the roster and you think, yeah, okay, there's enough talent to be able to turn it around, but can they actually? And it makes me wonder, did the Warriors' aggressive pursuit of KD actually really, really hurt the Suns to a degree here? It actually worked in the Warriors' favor, where the Warriors seemed, by reports, to be so aggressive trying to trade for KD to the point where they actually convinced the Suns to do it. And Phoenix were like, okay, yep, we're we'll make this happen. And it was only KD that stepped in and said, no, I don't want to go. And I don't want to leave the Suns mid-season. And now you've kind of got this fractured locker room potentially where Kevin Durant, who's, I think, still the best player on the team, I classify him a better player than Devin Booker, like, he's looking around thinking, hey, like, this front office just tried to trade me. And so what does that do to a chemistry of the team? And I think you've seen that in the Suns' recent performances. Like, they look like a team that's disconnected, and therefore, again, their potential of rising above the Warriors or other teams in the Western Conference, I think it's going to be hard for them to do. So a good result in terms of the Spurs beating them today. The other one was the Bucks beating the Clippers, which is a good result for the Warriors. I think Golden State, looking at the standings now, the 6th seed is about the highest they can get to, or the most realistic. The Clippers currently occupy the 6th seed, so that loss for them today puts them 3 games ahead of the Warriors, which again is a little bit of a buffer, but it is something that can be overrun here in the last 27 games for Golden State if they're good enough, right? And the key question is, are they good enough now with the recent acquisition of Jimmy Butler, with the imminent return of Jonathan Kuminga? It's going to be a wait and see, but the early signs are really positive based on the 4 games we saw with Butler prior to the All-Star break, with the Warriors going 3-1, all those games on the road. They're going to have a heap of home games coming up here, and they've got a very easy schedule as well. Before I get into that, tomorrow's game against the Kings, just a little bit of a preview of that one, because right now the Warriors and Kings are both dead even, 28 and 27 in the standings. So the Kings are currently 9th, the Warriors are 10th, but obviously Golden State can overtake Sacramento with a win tomorrow in Sacramento. Obviously, it's going to be difficult, but I think if the Warriors are serious, and they are serious about taking every game as essentially a playoff game, as essentially must win, then this is a game they should be winning, right? Because I look at this and I'm trying to look at this through a playoff lens, which again is difficult when there's still 27 games to go in the regular season. But the way I usually view playoff games is that if you've got the best 2 players in the game, you should win, right? You're probably going to win. Right? And that's what I see with the Warriors. Like, I think Steph Curry, Jimmy Butler are the 2 best players on both teams tomorrow, right? Or later today for you guys. It's the time zone stuff's getting a little bit complicated here, but it doesn't matter. Steph Curry and Jimmy Butler, to me, the best 2 players. They are better than Zach LaVine, DeMarcus Sabonis, DeMar DeRozan. Now, that doesn't mean that they are going to have better games than those guys. And that doesn't mean that Sacramento aren't capable. In fact, I'm not... What are the odds right now? Let me just check this. Because I think Sacramento might be favorites. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. No, the Warriors are just favorites, according to Sportsbet, an Australian bookmaker. The Warriors are 1.5 point favorites, which I think is about right, because I think, again, the Warriors should have the best 2 players in this game. Right, Sacramento 20th in defense at the moment. I think that's an area the Warriors can really exploit. Now, the injury report is quite extraordinary for this time of the season, with so many health and injury concerns around the league. We've seen Wemby, we've seen what's happening with the Mavericks at the moment, who don't have a big man whatsoever. They've just signed Moses Brown to a 10-day contract. There are 2 players on the injury report total for both teams. Sacramento do not have anyone on the injury report. They are fully healthy and available for Doug Christie to go through and utilize whatever rotation he wants. The Warriors, Jonathan Kuminga, the only injury for them. Sounds like JK obviously will miss tomorrow's game and will miss Sunday's game against the Dallas Mavericks, which is also Andre Iguodala's jersey retirement game. I haven't really spoken about that. Shout out to Iggy, obviously a legend of the Warrior franchise, and that's going to be immortalized now with his jersey retirement. So looking forward to that one. Steve Kerr said today that JK has returned to practice, but hasn't yet scrimmaged with the team, so he's still a way off. Sounds like he's obviously going to miss the next 2 games, and then we'll wait and see after that. Hopefully return next week sometime for Jonathan Kuminga, but the Warriors haven't really set a date yet for his expected return, but obviously we do think it is coming imminently. The only other player on the injury report is Yuri Collins, which is an interesting one because he's only just signed a 10-day contract with the Warriors, but he's remaining with Santa Cruz to play in their game against the Oklahoma City Blue tomorrow as well. So only 2 players on the injury report combined for both teams and 0 for the Kings, which means this is almost both teams at full strength. Obviously, Kuminga's a big piece that the Warriors won't have. But we've also got to take recent history out of this. Obviously, the Kings beat the Warriors about a month ago, but since that point, the Warriors have acquired Jimmy Butler in a blockbuster trade, and of course, the Kings made their own blockbuster trade, sending out De'Aaron Fox and bringing back in Zach LaVine. So the Kings, again, 21st in defense. I think in my head, like just thinking ahead to this game, I believe like Butler's going to be really, really important because I look at Sacramento and think, okay, what have they got from an interior defense standpoint, right? Like Malik Monk, DeMar DeRozan, Zach LaVine, perimeter guys, Keegan Murray, Sabonis. Like there's not a lot of interior defense there, but then I actually looked at the numbers. So I thought that in my head, then I looked at the numbers and their interior defense is okay. It's their defensive, opposing 3-point percentage where they give up the second highest percentage on threes in the league, which is really interesting because it sounds like, again, not watching every Sacramento game, but it's probably a bit of a Warrior issue where like they collapse a lot into the paint because they know on the interior they don't necessarily have the huge shot blocking, rim protecting presence, and therefore that leaves open shooters. Now, can the Warriors, who are a team that have really struggled shooting the ball over the 4 games since Butler's arrival, can they take advantage of that and actually shoot high 30s, above 40% from 3? They have ranked 24th in 3-point percentage since Butler's arrival, right? And again, I mentioned this on the podcast episode I did yesterday with Matt Hannafin. Jimmy Butler's arrival has flipped the Warriors from a team that was above average in 3-point shooting percentage-wise to a team that's now 24th in 3-point percentage and taken them from a team that was bottom 3 in both free throw attempts and free throw percentage to a team with Butler in 4 games that's been top 5 in both categories. So that just goes to show you the impact of Jimmy Butler, but it's going to be really fascinating to see if the Warriors can take advantage of the Kings' defensive issues, both on the interior and from 3-point range as well. And it's also going to be interesting to see if the Warriors can actually guard, because obviously losing Andrew Wiggins, that's been a huge question mark. The Warriors' defense, can they actually guard Sacramento, who have still, despite losing De'Aaron Fox, still have plenty of offensive firepower with Monk, with LaVine coming in, with DeRozan, with Sabonis. Therefore, from a Warriors standpoint, how much, Gary Payton II are you going to see? Is he going to have to play heavy minutes to be able to guard guys like LaVine and Monk? How much Kevon Looney are you going to see? Because he obviously has a good history going back to the 2023 playoffs in guarding Domantas Sabonis. So it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of lineup Steve puts on the floor, what guys we see. Like we saw Draymond start at the 5 in 2 of the 3 games leading into the All-Star break. Does that continue? I think it might. I have issues, obviously, that I've spoken about a heap previously in terms of the sustainability of that from Draymond's perspective and him holding up physically. Obviously, it's going to be a tough battle with Sabonis. He's capable of doing it, but do you want him doing it for long periods in terms of being able to preserve him over the rest of the season? It's a hard balance to find because I think the Warriors' best lineup does have Draymond at the 5, but also you want to be able to be in a situation where you don't wear him down to the point where he's got nothing left come the playoffs if you do manage to make it that far. So that's a balance that Steve's going to have to try and find, right? Moving on from tomorrow's game against the Kings and the schedule overall here for the Warriors moving forward, they have the second easiest schedule of any team in the Western Conference remaining, only behind the Timberwolves, which a bit of a problem with the Timberwolves because that's one team you'd like to try and overtake to be able to jump up to that 6th seed. But it's still like Golden State have a real opportunity here to create some momentum or continue the momentum they found and discovered before the All-Star break and take that on with them and try and finish these last, what would be 31 games, let's say the 27 remaining plus the 4 prior to the All-Star break, 31 games, and try and win 22 of them, like 22-9, or something like that, which would mean, obviously going like 18 or 19 and let's say 19 and 8 from this position with 27 games remaining, which is going to be a tough ask. But again, they've got the schedule. I think they've got the health right now, which is obviously a huge thing. Like, there's so many teams around the league that are struggling from an injury standpoint. And the Warriors, again, minus Kuminga, who should be back within the next few games here, they are looking fine from an injury standpoint. Now, there's going to be wear and tear and players that are sore. Everyone's sore and a little bit banged up at this point in the season. That's just what it is in an 82-game season. But the Warriors, they don't have any kind of short, medium, long-term injuries, again, aside from Kuminga. So they've got the schedule. They've got the current freeness of injury that should allow them to go on a bit of a run here if they're good enough, right? And if you look at the other teams in the Western Conference, the Lakers have the hardest remaining schedule. They've come off a back-to-back against two pretty easy teams in the Hornets and the Trailblazers. They lost at home to the Hornets, then won today against Portland, which is a little surprising. You would have thought they'd win the Hornets matchup and actually lose to the Trailblazers, who have been playing pretty well recently. But anyway, they get split that, go 1-1. They have the hardest schedule remaining. The Suns then have the second hardest schedule remaining, which goes back to my point of, like, they don't look like a team right now that are going to overtake the Warriors or any other team and make the top 10 and reach the play-in tournament. Then you've got the Nuggets, the Kings, the Clippers, and the Grizzlies that round out the top 6 in the hardest remaining schedule. So they are 6 Western Conference teams all ahead. Oh, sorry, not all ahead, because the Suns are one spot behind, but 5 teams are ahead and 1 spot directly below the Warriors in the Western Conference standings. So again, that raises some optimism of Golden State potentially climbing up here and getting to the 6th seed, which again, I think is probably their best hope at this point to try and get to that spot. Maybe, get out of the play-in tournament entirely. Maybe face a team like Memphis in the first round. Houston, we'll see if the Lakers can push up to that position. Hopefully, you'd probably avoid Denver or Oklahoma City just because OKC clearly the number 1 team right now. The Nuggets with Jokic, I don't think the Warriors or any other team have an answer for that, but particularly the Warriors don't really have an answer for Nikola Jokic. So you'd hope to avoid those 2 teams, and I think you probably have to get to the 6th seed in order to do so, but we'll wait and see. In terms of the roster right now, so the Warriors have just signed Kevin Knox II and Yuri Collins to 10-day contracts. I'm completely on the opposite end of the spectrum with each of these signings. Kevin Knox, I think, is a brilliant signing. I think I've been, you guys that listen or watch me, I've been clamoring for Kevin Knox to be on the roster for quite some time here. He's been absolutely killing it in the G League. I wanted him on the roster in the offseason when I saw what he did in Summer League, and I think part of that was because, again, I've said it plenty of times before, but I really appreciated and respected the fact that he put his hand up as a former top 10 pick 6 years into his NBA career and said, I actually need to do this for the good of my career. And I think he's gone back. He's kind of respected that level. And I think we shouldn't underestimate, a highly talented guy who once had visions of becoming a star in the NBA, actually going back to the G League, going to Summer League, and actually putting in the work. And I think he's done that. Now, here's a guy who has the worst win-loss percentage of any active player in the NBA, who shoots less than 40% from the field in his career, and who has, I think, a total cumulative plus minus of minus 1,230 in his career, right? So that would tend to think, like, what makes this different, right? What makes this a possible trash into treasure for Golden State, right? From a guy that was thrown away by 4 different teams, by the Detroit Pistons twice over a 6-year span. What makes this time around with Golden State different? And I've spoken about it previously. I spoke about it on the episode that I did nearly a week ago now, once there were reports that the Warriors would sign him to a 10-day contract. The fact that he is now on a team that is trying to compete rather than being more focused on lottery position and stuff like that, I think that's huge. And I think he also, he's 25, he's still young, and maybe in the last couple of years, he's really matured I read an article earlier today where he's really trying to use his athleticism and his size to make sure like his paint first and foremost, like his inside first and foremost, and then outside with his shooting. And I think sometimes maybe in the past he's got a little bit jump shot heavy, and he's trying to fix that element. Trying to be more attentive and better on defense, which I think is another big thing. He's rebounding the ball at a really high rate in the G League, like 8 boards a game. Like, he has got the physical tools. There's never been a doubt about that. He's got the talent. There's a reason he was taken in the top 10 of the draft. He's 6'7", 6'8", good to really good athleticism, can shoot the ball. In 12 regular season games in the G League so far, he's averaging over 25 points a game, 8 rebounds. He's 53% from the floor. He's over 44% from three-point range. So I don't really care what he did in the first 6 years of his career. Yes, that comes into it, no doubt about that. But you look at these numbers in the G League and you see the profile of player you've got with a big forward who can shoot the ball and is athletic. Like, he just deserves the opportunity. Like, that's a simple, like, this is what life should be about. You work your way up, right? And he maybe got things handed on a platter to him in terms of playing opportunity and stuff in his younger days, and he didn't take advantage of that. But again, he's gone back down a level, and he's worked his backside off by the sound of it, and that's proven in the numbers that he's put up, and therefore he just deserves this opportunity to me. And he can also fill a need for the Warriors. And I'd actually like to see him play a little bit, because I think if he comes up and doesn't play, then like it's kind of what's the point? Now, Yuri Collins, on the other hand, I think Yuri Collins, and I think this is further evidenced by the fact that he's not actually active for this game against the Kings. He's still with Santa Cruz in the G League. This is simply the Warriors signing a guy to a 10-day contract because they have to reach the minimum 14-player roster, which is what they need to do. They need to reach the 4. They've had their 2 weeks. You can only have like maximum of 2 weeks throughout a season with less than 14. They've had that now. Therefore, they had to sign a guy, and they've just picked out Yuri Collins from the G League. This guy, to me, will not have an impact on Golden State in any way, shape, or form. I think it's probably a mistake, but I also appreciate that it's just, hey, we just have to reach the minimum level players on the roster. And that's why they've done it. Like, he's a 6-foot point guard. Like, he's a very good playmaker, very good passer. You could argue the Warriors need a point guard with Dennis Schroeder out of the mix, but I would have liked one with a little more higher upside who you could look at and think he could actually be in the rotation. Like, Yuri Collins is not going to be above Pat Spencer, and Pat Spencer's not in the rotation himself, right? You got a 6-foot point guard who's a very questionable three-point shooter. I think he shot less than 32% in college. Over his 4 years, he's still around that mark in the G League. Doesn't take a whole heap of threes. He took like 1.5 a game throughout his 4 college years. So that, to me, like, there's just no use for him. I'm sorry, I know it sounds brutal, but there's no use for Yuri Collins on this version of the Golden State Warriors. And I simply think it's a case of, hey, who's been working their backside off? Who's been putting good performances up in the G League? Let's reward that by giving him a 10-day contract, even though we know we're not going to utilize him. And I think that's completely different to Kevin Knox, who, again, is also getting rewarded for excellent G League form. But I actually do genuinely think he could play a role and he could have an impact on this Warrior team. Doesn't mean he will necessarily, doesn't mean it will be a positive impact, but I can see the vision of what Kevin Knox could be for this Warrior team, who need a kind of another big forward who can score the basketball, who can shoot the basketball. And that's what Kevin Knox does. So in terms of the potential impact from these two players, Kevin Knox is like on one end of the spectrum and Yuri Collins is on the other, right? But I'm actually like excited to see, Kevin Knox hasn't been active for an NBA game in over a year now, played 31 games for the Pistons last season. I think he will probably get a rest of season contract after this 10-day. I'd be surprised if he didn't. He'd have to do a lot wrong, I think, not to get a rest of season deal here or a standard deal after the 10-day contract. I don't even think he has to do a whole lot positively. I'm not sure how much opportunity he's going to get. Maybe he does see some minutes before Kuminga comes back because the Warriors want another 6'7", 6'8" athletic guy who can score in the front court. Maybe that's a thing. We'll wait and see here. But I think he's a guy you could see on a standard deal after the 10-day contract. Yuri Collins, to me, is a bit of a placeholder and the Warriors should be pretty frantically looking around and hoping maybe that someone becomes available on a buyout. But if you're the Warriors and you wanted a point guard, a ball handler who's an excellent passer, playmaker, but doesn't necessarily shoot the ball very well, why didn't you go harder after Ben Simmons? Why didn't you go after Markelle Fultz, who we're going to see for the Kings in this game after they picked him up? So a couple of former number one overall picks there who obviously have talent, who have shown some stuff in the NBA. Why wouldn't you have gone harder after those guys rather than a guy who's got no NBA experience whatsoever, and again, who's 6 foot tall, not a legitimate three-point shooter? I'm not trying to bash Yuri Collins here, and his story is fantastic, from going undrafted, playing for the Warriors in Summer League, playing for Santa Cruz, and being rewarded with this opportunity is great. I think it's also just a mistake, though, from a Warrior perspective, and I'd expect that to change after this 10-day contract. I'd expect them to pick someone else up. I'd be very surprised if Yuri Collins got a standard contract and remained on the team for the rest of this season following the 10-day deal. In terms of the rotation, I like now that the Butler trade has been made. The Warriors have a pretty set rotation here, and I mean, they've only got like 12 guys plus Knox and Collins now on the roster. So there's no longer what we saw early in the season where it was like 13, 14 guys who are capable of playing. I think they've got a very set, probably top 7, I would say, with Steph, Pods, Butler, Kuminga when he comes back, Draymond, Moody, and Looney. That's kind of my 7 that I think will just play every game, right? Then, like, Steph's clearly not going to go to a 7-man rotation, at least not at this point of the season. So I think Buddy Hield will still play. Buddy Hield, I know fans might not like it, Buddy Hield will still play off the bench. Okay, that will happen. And I think you've also got to play Quentin Post. I think he still deserves minutes. I think he hasn't done a whole lot wrong. The defense still needs some work, but what he does as a floor spacing big man is incredibly important to Golden State, and his minutes will fluctuate. Sometimes he'll only play 10 minutes. Sometimes that might extend out to 20, maybe even more than that. But I think he'll still be part of the rotation. So to me, that's a pretty clear 9-man rotation. Steph, Pods, Butler, Kuminga, Dre, Moody, Looney, Hield, Post. Right? That's the 9. Now, we'll wait and see what happens with the starting lineup, whether Dre's starting at the 5, whether Post comes back into the mix here after Draymond started 2 of the last 3 games before the break. What happens with Kuminga once he kind of gets rolling again and gets off a minutes restriction? Could he possibly start alongside Steph, Pods, Butler, and Draymond in the starting lineup? We will wait and see, but I like that. That's a pretty clear 9 to me. The rest, you've obviously got GP2. He's going to play some minutes, okay? Most of the time, I think Steve will probably go to a 10-man rotation, and GP2 will still see some minutes, particularly in a game like, against the Kings, where he might have to go out and guard a Zach LaVine or a DeMar DeRozan or a Malik Monk. Obviously some major perimeter threats there for the Kings. You've got Guy Santos, who I'm not going to be opposed if he's out on the floor. I just think we've probably got to a point where you need to make some harsh calls, and maybe he's one that falls out of the rotation. TJD has clearly been out of the rotation, out of the mix here for the last couple of weeks. And then you've got Knox and Collins. Collins is going to be out of the mix. Knox, before Kuminga comes back, like if Steve wants to go like 10 deep, I'd actually almost give Knox an opportunity above Santos just to see what he can do. Now, I think you probably know what you've got, obviously, with Guy and what he can provide, and that can be useful and valuable at times, particularly with the hard work that he does on the floor in terms of defense, rebounding, hustle plays and stuff like that. But I also think Kevin Knox is a far greater offensive talent, can put the ball in the hoop, and therefore that brings its own value, particularly to a front court that does have some shooting and scoring worries with a bunch of guys like, Kuminga's a scorer, but, obviously isn't necessarily a spacing threat. Draymond, not really a scorer. Looney, not really a scorer. So it's going to be a wait and see on what happens with the Warrior rotation here, but I think there's a pretty clear 9 there for Steve Kerr to utilize over the final 27 games of the season. So before I finish up here, where can the Warriors get to? We've obviously had Draymond come out and say he thinks they'll win the championship. I think he's probably being serious. I don't think he was joking about that. Now, whether he's being way too optimistic is another question entirely. I'm not going to go there with Draymond at this point. Like, I just can't claim that a team that's, even as a Warrior fan, I can't claim that a team that's 28, 27, and 10th in the Western Conference standings at the All-Star break is going to win the championship. That would just be like unheard of. really. So to me, this team, I'd be surprised if they don't make the playoffs. Like you look at all the different things, like the schedule, like the lack of injuries compared to other teams around them, the schedule compared to other teams around them. The fact they've just got Jimmy Butler, they've got two really high-end quality players. They're about to get Kuminga back. Draymond's still a really, really good player. Like, this is a pretty good team now, I think, and I think it's a playoff team, right? If you don't make the playoffs from this position, then you're going to want a pretty good excuse as to why, and it's probably going to be, there was a significant injury to Steph Curry and or Jimmy Butler over the last 25 games. That would be the only excuse to me as to why you wouldn't make the playoffs from this position. Okay? Because I think they can at least get top 8. And therefore, if they get top 8, they're going to get 2 opportunities. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. I don't see a fully healthy Steph Curry and Jimmy Butler losing 2 straight play-in tournament games and one of them at home. Okay? I just don't think that's going to happen. Right? I have faith and trust. Like, these guys are superstar players. And Draymond's a noted playoff performer as well. Like, I think they will win 1 of 2 play-in tournament games. Now, if they get to 9 or if they remain 9 or 10, that's a bit of a different question mark, because obviously you've got to win 2 games. And that would be really, really disappointing from this position if they can't get up into the top 8. So I think they will make the playoffs. They should make the playoffs. They need to make the playoffs from this position. Now, I think they can be really dangerous. I think they can be really, really dangerous. I think there's no team at the top of the standings that are going to want to face them. I think the Thunder. Right, I think the Thunder would probably look down and say to themselves, yeah, we'd rather play, any of the other teams, really. Like, do we really want to be coming up against Steph Curry and Jimmy Butler? Do we really want to be coming up against a team that actually has been pretty competitive and won games? Like, the Warriors are 2-1 against the Thunder this season. As I mentioned on the podcast yesterday, the Warriors are 7-4 against the top 4 seeds in the West. So again, like, they can be dangerous, right? And so I'm not going to go with Draymond and say they're going to win a championship, but could there be an upset in the first round? Yeah, absolutely, right? Could they make it all the way through to the West Finals? Possible. Like, I'm with Draymond in saying that, like, there's no teams that I think, like, the Warriors don't have any shot against, right? I actually am more worried about the Nuggets and facing them in the first round than I would be the Thunder. I'd actually probably rather face the Thunder. I know that sounds weird, but I just think Jokic is so unstoppable from a Warrior perspective that, like, I just don't want to face him. I think he's the best player in the world. Shea's obviously great, but I think the Warriors have a better opportunity to try and beat him and the Thunder than they do the Nuggets. Let me know if I'm wrong and if you think different, but that's just my opinion. And then, other teams, the Grizzlies. Like, can the Warriors beat the Grizzlies in a playoff matchup? Yeah. Like, I think they can. Can they beat the Rockets? Yeah, I think they can. Can they beat the Lakers? I don't know. They wouldn't be favorites, but, like, the Lakers defensively, obviously, with Luka and, LeBron, Austin Reeves, like, offensively, they're going to be great. Will either team be able to guard each other? Who knows? Like, this is all, forecasting to potential playoff matchups that we might not even see. But I think Draymond's onto something in terms of there's probably not any team that the Warriors are going to go up against and just lie there and say, we don't have a chance in the world. Okay, they're going to have a chance against any of these teams, like a legitimate chance. I'm not saying they're going to be favorites, but like they can cause some trouble. Right, that's all I'll say in terms of how far the Warriors can go. They can cause some trouble. Can they win a playoff series? I think they can. But first of all, they need to get to the playoffs, and that in itself is still going to be a task, albeit a one that they should complete. This should be a playoff team by season's end. I'm going to finish it up there. Thank you very much to those of you that have tuned in. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel already, that would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me at POK252. That's POK252 on X/Twitter. I'll be back for a post-game live after the Kings game. Let's hope for a Warrior victory. That will be 3 hours basically after the game starts. So game starts at 7, so it'll be 10 p.m. Pacific time. Hopefully you guys in California or wherever on the West Coast can tune into that one. Or those of you in Australia, it'll be like 5 p.m., which is a lot more manageable for me and the rest of us in Australia. Until then, guys, thank you very much again.